Good afternoon to you. Mark Sutton with HurricaneTrack.com here with your Hurricane Outlook and discussion for the 4th of July, 2018. July 4th, yep, it is Independence Day, and we do have a lot to talk about, so let's jump right into it. The latest tropical weather outlook just was issued here a little bit early, 1:29 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. And if we mouse over these features, 40% in the 48-hour time frame, 60% over the next 5 days for this system that is well off the east coast, the southeast coast of the U.S. And there you see it there, rather disorganized. And then we have this system, which, I mean, my goodness, 30%? That's all? That really looks impressive out there. 30% is it. That's all the love it's getting from the National Hurricane Center. As they mention, that little organization has occurred with the shower activity, and recent satellite-derived wind data and visible satellite images suggest that the system may not have a closed surface wind circulation, although some development is still possible over the next day or so while it moves westward at 10 to 15 miles per hour. Notice that, 10 to 15 miles per hour. It's not moving west at 25, and that's a big clue to me. The trade winds are not screaming from east to west. West at 10 to 15. Interesting. All right, so let's examine what's happening in the Eastern Pacific real quick, and then we'll move on to the different analysis products that I'm going to show you regarding what's labeled as Invest 95L. We'll get to that in just a minute. Probably a little bit of a mistake happening, but it doesn't matter. Anyway, in the Eastern Pacific, we have Fabio, which never made it to major hurricane status. It never made it to Category 3 or higher. Here is the latest infrared satellite from Levi Cowan's site at Tropical Tidbits, and fairly impressive. It still has an eye structure, but it never quite made it to major hurricane. And remember, I was remarking that these systems in the Eastern Pacific were lacking the intensity, even though we were getting a lot of them, and a lot was made of this big burst coming. And I was suspect. I said, I don't know. It's interesting to see how they are failing after we had Aletta and Bud to become very strong. And here, this latest system, Fabio, failed to reach Category 3 or higher. Just for the record, all right? So maybe the Pacific, the Eastern Pacific, is not as favorable as we once thought recently. All right, whatever. We'll worry about that later. Let's take a look at the Atlantic Basin. Here is our system. I guess eventually will be 96L, and here is 95L. Now, excuse me, don't know where that came from. Maybe I swallowed a gnat. No, that's not what happened. The normal naming convention for when a system is a suspect area is 90 through 99, and the letter L for Atlantic, and then they recycle them. It just keeps going and going and going. And we had 90 and 91L already, and so this should have been 92L over here, but somebody accidentally called it 95L. So be it. It doesn't really matter, I guess, in the long term. We'll get into this in more detail in just a moment. Let's first look at some of the other interesting things that are going on this satellite image. A beautiful visible satellite shot from the GO 16 is animated here, again from Levi's site, Tropical Tidbits. This area of energy sitting over southeast Texas, I remarked a couple of days ago that it looked like it would track over towards this area. Of course, it's not like I came up with that all by myself. That's what the computer models were indicating, and lo and behold, they were correct, much to the dismay of our good friends in southeast Texas, and specifically the Harris County area and vicinity, Houston to be even more specific, with lots of flooding once again, stranded cars, flooded roadways. You guys, you just can't catch a break. This will move on, and at least, as I mentioned, it didn't become a wind machine, but the water part was a big deal, and once again we're seeing that come to fruition in the Houston area. We must take these tropical disturbances seriously, no matter what they are called, whether it's a depression, an area of investigation, a disturbance, whatever. Tropical storm, Category 1 hurricane, this whole idea of the category system and people not paying much attention until it reaches a certain threshold is just hogwash, and we see that coming very painfully into fruition, as I just said, here in the Houston area once again. All right, off the East Coast, upper level low here spinning westward as this big area of high pressure is dominating over the northwest Atlantic and southeast Canada, and that upper level low, cold air in the mid to upper levels, and so you will have some instability, pop-up showers and thunderstorms. But then this is trying to develop eventually and move around this way, eventually picked up by this trough that's going to carve off the East Coast and send it out to sea. So limited chances for development. It might rough up the seas a little bit, maybe bringing an increase in rip current threats, etc., to parts of the East Coast. So we will monitor that closely over the coming days. No problems for Bermuda, if you're wondering, so don't worry about that. It'll pass between Cape Hatteras and Bermuda there. All right, so 95L down here along the intertropical convergence zone, pulling in some energy and moisture from far below the 10-degree latitude line right there. So this is just barely within the main development region. The same main development region that everybody was saying was so hostile this year, and you can clearly see in this satellite animation the rotation and this very vigorous tropical wave, and it's only July 4th. So I'm not going to make too much of it yet, but if we continue to see this throughout the month, just like we saw last year and other years, the last several years we've had MDR sort of half-baked development in July, and certainly in 16 and 17 that led to a fairly busy and very destructive last year especially season. Now, does that mean that's what's going to happen this year? No, it does not. But if we're starting to get development here when conditions through this area are supposed to be so hostile, it just gives me pause and says, all right, climatologically it's rare to have development down there, so what's going to happen in another 30 to 45 days when the climatological background state becomes better anyway? The whole base level will come up, so to speak. So if we're getting development or attempted development now, that certainly raises some concern that it could be not as hostile. Now, there are things that could mitigate that. We could have very strong westerly winds that just cut across this region. If this warming event in the Pacific, the El Nino, comes on stronger, we'll just have to wait and see. But for now, July 4th, there it is. So let's take a look at some of the structural considerations here for these different systems, and I am going to draw on this using the color white. So here's the vorticity over Houston and vicinity, eastern Texas, and remember this came as a mesoscale convective system off the coast, something like that, and worked its way westward. And had it been about 100 miles farther out into the Gulf, this would probably be a strong tropical storm, minimal hurricane, over 30 degrees Celsius water moving into Houston. But it's not. It's a big rainmaker, and as I have mentioned ad nauseum, that's big enough and problematic enough. Here's the energy trying to gather south of Bermuda, and this will kind of take off this way with not much fanfare overall, but we'll certainly watch it. And then here's the vorticity signature. And by vorticity, I'm talking about the spin in the atmosphere. And that helps me to understand how much energy is getting pulled in and bundled. And when you have this rounded appearance, which we do have down here with 95L, that shows me that, okay, it's trying to do something. And there is the vorticity signature of Fabio over there off the left. So overall, the structure of the system looks fairly impressive, and it's trying to develop. And in fact, if we zoom in on it, there you go. This is from the weathernerds.org site. Fairly vigorous tropical wave with a low-level circulation trying to develop in there, perhaps. You do see these pop up. Amazing with this satellite animation. Heavier, what we call hot towers of strong thunderstorms or updrafts in the atmosphere, so the upward motion definitely there. And it's trying to develop. And the weather, not the weather world, the hurricane, the weather geeks, that's what I'm trying to say. Believe me, there's a lot of people watching this And many of them are saying, look, this looks like a tropical depression, but we will defer to the expert analysis of the National Hurricane Center. And I talked about the outlook that so far the available products do not indicate that this is developing into a depression just yet. So will it? Well, this is where we can really dig in and analyze some things. First of all, the total precipitable water, an amazing feature here. This is from the University of Wisconsin. There it is right there. So it definitely has a nice envelope of moisture to work with. It's not robbed of the moisture right now from the Saharan dust and the Saharan air layer that's been so prevalent. You see an intrusion here, but this seems to be rather well incubated and isolated from that. And then again, here's our system rotating west that brought all the rain from Louisiana now into Houston. And then here's our gathering moisture plume here. But let's focus on what's happening with 95L. So it's got moisture, and now let's look at the sea surface temperatures. Do we have warm enough sea surface temperatures? Well, here's the 26 Celsius line, which is roughly what you need to get development, and it's just barely in the ballpark. So just barely there, marginal, yet with marginal sea surface temperatures, I just showed you in that animation, look, I mean, it's trying to develop those pop-up towers of deeper convection. It's not developing a CDO, what we call the central dense overcast, but the banding is there. I mean, and for July 4th in the MDR that's colder than normal, with all the Saharan air around, and we got this, wow, that is impressive, you have to admit. So it does have marginal sea surface temperatures to work with. What about upper ocean heat content? Again, just a little bit right in there, just starting to show up on the lower part of the scale over here. So there is a little bit of deeper ocean water to work with that's warm, deeper in the sense that that warm water extends not just on the skin of the ocean, but a few tens of meters deep perhaps. So it's got a little bit of a margin to work with. It's right on the edge there of being able to try to use what it's got. So where's it headed? Well, again, remarkable agreement here with the modeling. A lot of models now picking up on this, and the guidance envelope over the next several days, if it were to survive, headed towards generally the northern Leeward Islands. Now look, I want to caution you. Before folks in this area get upset or worried, I'm going to go ahead and tell you, do not be. Do not worry about this developing, and this is where showing models and then not putting context to it is, I think, a disservice, and people who do it and just throw this out there and say, look out, you're doing it wrong. So here we have model guidance, and they all bring this over towards the leewards and eventually the Virgin Islands and towards Puerto Rico. And why do I not think that this is going to be a problem once it gets to this area? Well, I'm going to show you. First of all, so this is the track guidance, very tightly clustered for the next 5 days. Either models are getting real good or the pattern's easy to define, maybe both. But the intensity guidance is where you can say, oh, okay, we don't have too much to worry about. Even the statistical guidance, which is generally more bullish overall, modest strengthening almost to hurricane intensity, but the rest of the reliable dynamic guidance, etc., and certainly the global models and the environmental factors suggesting maybe it becomes a weak tropical storm wind-wise over the next few days before something happens. And what will that something be? We'll get into that in a moment. So do not worry that a strengthening system is headed your way. Climatology is against it. The background environment is against it. So you folks here in the windwards and leewards, the windwards I'm not too worried about at all, but the leewards, the Virgin Islands, and Puerto Rico, pay attention, which you always should, but don't lose any sleep over this at all. And if we look at, this is really interesting to me. Look at some of the interest, I just said that, the parameters here in the ship's diagnostic. So the ship's model, the statistical hurricane intensity prediction scheme, indicates all the different reasons, statistically speaking, that this will develop. And I want to point out some relevant parts of this, bunch of numbers that we're looking at. First of all, let's look at the shear, and let's change this color to yellow, our highlighter. The shear, which is right here, all right, I'm sorry, let's get rid of that. I screwed up. Try again, Mark. The shear right there, currently 9 knots, 10 knots, forecast, 6 hours out, 12 hours. So shear over the next 72 hours or so, even 84, so let's call it 3 days. The shear, relatively not a problem. I mean, honestly, anything under 13 knots, come on. But by days 4 through 5, it really increases. All right? So this has about a 3-day window to develop. Sea surface temperatures right now, 26.5 Celsius. Gets a little cooler, and then a little, 25.6. That's below where it should be, but then those sea surface temperatures increase quite a bit. However, you're going to run into this problem of the shear. Let's change that to red over here. All right, so warmer sea surface temperatures, yes. Shear, no. That's a no-go there for this to continue to develop. And other things I like to look at, the 200 millibar temperatures, definitely cold. And you need that. You have to have that very cold air aloft to create the instability. So the instability is not going to be an issue with this system. And that minus 55, that's getting it. When we launched our weather balloon during Hurricane Nate, we recorded minus 74 Celsius up at, I can't remember it. Well, I remember the altitude. It was about 59,000 feet, somewhere in there. It was above 50,000 feet, which is obviously, if my math is correct, above 200 millibars. It's all in a graph somewhere else, but that's cold. That's 103 below zero. So minus 55 at the 200 millibar level, which is typically about as high as these systems will reach. And that's the outflow level. What is that, about 40,000 or something? I can't remember. My fault. But that's cold, and so that's a favorable parameter right there. Other things to look at, come on, where was it? Right here, the relative humidity. For the time being, fairly favorable, especially when you see these 70s, the mid-level relative humidity, but then it drops off here into the 50s, and that's a negative right there. So the bottom line, looking at the ship's diagnostic, and this is very helpful and very detailed if you want to go through all that, but these are the parameters that I look at. I want to look at the shear, and obviously its proximity to land, which is nil right now. The temperatures up in the upper part of the atmosphere in terms of the vertical instability, and the relative humidity, the major parameters. And for right now, the next 3 days, they are favorable. So I tend to think that this has a shot at becoming a tropical depression over time. And hey, maybe there'll be a recon mission in, what is that, the 7th? So 3 days from now, something like that. That's right around the time that the clock will start to run out on the system. But they could fly out and do training, get some flight hours in, maybe some research. It's always worthy and never a waste of time, in my opinion. Now, this is the current setup for the upper level winds. Here's our system over here. Let's use the color white. Again, not black. Come on, Mark. So this is the current setup. Right there's our... Come on, try again. There we go. And you can see really sharp trough here waiting for it. And yep, this is going to move into that over the next few days. Somewhat favorable with the green up here off the southeast coast. But again, not going to be a big deal between Bermuda, which is right there, and the east coast of the U.S. over here. But we'll watch that. I'm not dismissing it completely. I'm just saying I don't think it's going to be too big of a problem. So let's look at the GFS real quick. This is the 12Z run, the 850 millibar level showing the vorticity. And here is our system right here, the initial conditions. This is the minor reflectivity in the vorticity field of the system off the southeast coast. And there's your energy over southeast Texas, just for perspective. All right, so let's put this into motion. Get rid of the telestration, please. Thank you. And, oh, come on. Come on, there we go. It's just okay. Gremlins getting into the system today. So watch what happens. There's our system. small. So the model seeing it like it does, to me, is also telling. A very small system in the global model grid fields, and yet it's being picked up enough that it's there. All right, so then watch what happens though as it approaches the Antilles. Yeah, it starts to fizzle. So you got it embedded here in this trade wind flow, and it heads off towards the Antilles, but it's going to run into something rather nasty, which I'm going to show you in just a moment. Here's the Vorticity Signature for the feature off the East Coast. Not impressive at all. It gets pulled into this trough, no worries. But look at our system down here, 95, right there, there it is, and then it kind of fizzles out. Why does it do that? Let's go to the last frame just so I can show you. I really do want to put your mind at ease. This is 5 days out, and there it is, right in there, barely detectable, kind of embedded into the trade winds here. Maybe some passing showers, some gusty winds or something like that. But you folks in the Leeward Islands, the Virgin Islands, and Puerto Rico, honestly, do not worry about this too much. If that changes, obviously we will all let you know. No problem there. And you'll have plenty of time. But I don't think it's going to change because of this. Day 5, strong upper level low, just destructive wind shear in this area. So it's going to run into a buzzsaw, and whatever 95L develops into, it will undevelop rather quickly, as very strong upper level winds are going to be waiting for it in the western part of its track, of its life cycle, span, whatever. So there you go. A lot going on, including gremlins in my system, but nothing really to worry about. To me, it's more of an interesting development, and what it might mean down the road is sort of, I don't want to say strike one or whatever. I don't want to put too much into this, but it's kind of the first noticeable, okay, we had, some development in the MDR, in the middle of the MDR too, and not way over on the west side, in early July. So let's see. Let's let it be sort of a benchmark, and let's see if there's another benchmark later. You remember last season that we had those systems. We had Brett, and then we had Don, and then we had TD4, all over in the MDR. And then, of course, we had sort of a quiet period, and then things really ramped up once we got to Franklin, Gert, Harvey, and beyond. There was 10 hurricanes in a row. Now, that was because we had a much more favorable Atlantic. But when I see activity in the main development region, and it's not moving west at 25 miles per hour, so forth and so on, all the things I just went over, I do take notice, okay? So let's just kind of mark it down and remember it for later. Put a pin in it, as they say, and that's what we'll do. All right, that's it from me for today. I am going to be out of town tomorrow, but I suppose before I leave, I got to get up and get out pretty early, going up to Raleigh. College stuff for my daughter, obviously very important. But before I head out, I'll have to come in and be like, hey, I just woke up, and but I think I'll do an update before I leave. Let's just say that. It may not be the best sounding. We'll see. I'll do what I can. But I want to stay on top of these systems, so I'll crank out something not nearly as involved as this, but something, so we'll have something for tomorrow, and we'll see how things progress overnight. All right, have a safe 4th of July wherever you are. No getting fingers blown off, etc. Lose your hearing, poke an eye out with fireworks, because we got to have you back, all 100% pieces of you, to watch future videos, right? You got to. So please be safe. Have a good rest of your Wednesday, the 4th of July. Happy birthday, America. I am Mark Sudduth, HurricaneTrack.com. I'll be back with more for you tomorrow morning.